Hey guys, welcome back to another session of Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John. And today we're talking about families in America. And you're right, Jerry, families are a very complicated thing. And we're going to try to get into grips with some of that complexity without getting lost in all of the detail. Obviously, if you're interested in the family as a topic, there's a whole lot of research on it. So let's recap some of the theories approach the family. Of course, structural functional analysis sees the family as one of the key institutions in society because it helps to form individuals as they grow up. So socialization of children is seen as one of the most important tasks that the family will have. Again, having children, of course, the regulation of sexual activity and making sure we know who the children are is also another function of the family. So imagine if people were simply to go around randomly having sexual intercourse, we might not know whose children is whom and who's responsible for who. So again, regulating sexual activity then gives us the ability to say, as a society, he's your child, so you'd have to you're responsible for him. Another issue is social placement. So inheritance rights, again, tied to sexual relations and legitimate parentage, then create rights for some individuals. So they inherit the property of their parents, or they inherit the title of their parents. So in the past, in more rigid societies, caste-based societies, of course, this was essential. So it was extremely important to know who was the legitimate heir to the throne, for example. Because if you didn't know that, there's going to be a civil war over control of the throne. And that's going to be very disruptive to society. Same would be true for aristocrats and lords and nobles and things like that. For common peasants, it really wasn't that big a deal, and common peasants didn't necessarily always bother with such formalities as marriage and things like that because they didn't have any property. They had nothing to inherit. But in a class society, again, inheritance is not as important in terms of property as it is in terms of culture or social capital. So, for example, parents will inculcate or socialize their children into the values that they have or the beliefs that they have and help them move into the same social classes. So, again, it's still very important. The family is an institution in that sense. And, of course, material and emotional security. So, again, if you are the parent, you are considered responsible for the material well-being of your children. And this is rooted in the legal system because the legal system doesn't want to have to pay for everybody's children, unless they have to, of course, right? So the first thing they're going to say is, you're the parent, you're responsible, you need to take care of your child. And furthermore, you're responsible for the behavior of your child. Right? And the other side of that is emotional security, emotional well-being. We'll discuss more of these later on. Now, of course, you could criticize this, as many people do, partly because it tends to overlook that families change and they do different things at different times. So, for example, families today are very different from families 200 years ago or even 100 years ago. And the way it does things and its role in society have changed. So that diversity and change is not necessarily reflected in our understanding or the functionalist understanding of the family. Also, the fact that there are negative aspects to the family, like patriarchy, like family violence, like reproduction of inequality, which we'll discuss in a second. Social conflict and feminist analysis tend to look at more the negative side of the family. For example, the perpetuation of social inequality by reproducing the wealth inequality in society. The wealthy inherit wealth. Then what they have power over other people. Why do they have power? Simply because they inherited it. So some people may say this is the same as the kingship system or the monarchical system in the past, where people were born to be king, and it didn't matter how stupid they were or how ignorant they were, but yet they were going to become the king, right? So is this really good for society to give that wealth to people simply because they were born into that position? Patriarchy, again, this is more from a feminist perspective. Patriarchy is rooted in the traditional version or of the family. And again, this is something feminists have attacked. So one might say they're attacking a particular version of the family, not the family per se. Other factors such as racial, ethnic differences obviously are perpetuated within the family because each family is going to reproduce or re-socialize their children into the racial and ethnic patterns that they have. Finally, again, favoritism of heterosexuality. So the favoritism of the idea that families should be by nature, quote unquote, heterosexual as opposed to being perhaps homosexual. So we'll discuss those in more detail later. On the other hand, the criticism of the social conflict perspective is that how do you necessarily take care of all the different functions of the family without the family? So there could be other solutions, such as putting all children into adoption centers or putting all children into foster care or something of that sort. But is that really possible on a social scale? Would we want to live in a society where all children are raised by the state, as it were? Again, brings up a lot of debates. Micro-level theories of the family tend to focus more on how families have changed and shaped their own interactions. The changes within the family, such as sharing housework, changes in the perception or symbolism of things like divorce or single parenthood. So these have changed radically. They're no longer seen as stigmas, whereas in the past they tended to be stigmatized. Another theory is social exchange theory, focusing on how people use marriage and courtship to try to make the best deal. And this certainly was very true in the past, when marriages were often arranged for business purposes or relationship purposes between families. And even today, now more on an individual level, the idea that somebody might say, well, he's not good enough for me, I can do better, right, than that guy or that girl. Now, of course, there's the debate here. Critical evaluation of micro-level analysis is that it ignores the broader forces. So there's always a debate, for example, whether things like divorce is caused by macro-level changes in society or the economy. For example, women being expected to work or being allowed to work perhaps then gives them independence so they can opt for divorce. So that would be a macro level explanation of divorce. On the other hand, micro level explanation of divorce would be people become accustomed to seeing divorced parents, children of divorce, and it becomes normal. It becomes normalized. It's no longer seen as outrageous. So that's more on a micro level. Anyway, the micro-macro debate, as it were, I feel is not very useful in itself, but it's more useful to be able to look at both sides at once. So how is a family, how does a family life evolve? Well, I've kind of modified this section to give some idea of some of the complexity involved in the modern family. So, for example, you start off in childhood with experience of your own family, and of course, initially that's the only experience we have. But then as we grow a little older, we get to know our friends' families. We may say, why are they different? No, why is my family different? We start to realize that families are different. And maybe we prefer the way some other people's families are run to our own. But we have to realize we don't live in other people's families. We may only see the good side of their families, whereas in our own family, we'll see usually the good and the bad, right? Then, of course, as people grow up, nowadays, it's expected for people to move out of the family home generally when they become an adult. So you go to college, and after college, you aren't really expected to come back, although, of course, that still happens. In the past, however, women almost always would stay within the family until they were married. Men generally had the option of going out and doing something different and remaining single while they did it. The next stage is courtship. So this is the period when people get married or become engaged and get married. And of course, again, there's been a major change in society from in the past, and still today in many traditional societies, most marriages or many marriages are arranged. So the parents will arrange the marriage, or the parents will have a veto over the marriage, or there will maybe many social prescriptions against certain types of marriage. So, for example, interracial marriage wasn't allowed. Nowadays, there's a lot more emphasis on romantic love, getting married because you want to marry that other person, you fell in love, etc. So the interesting thing is this creates a lot of ideals around the relationship of marriage that didn't necessarily exist before. So 100, 200 years ago, when you got married, it wasn't expected that you would necessarily love the person you married. And very often when people talked about love, they talked about loving somebody other than their husband or wife. So the idea that now you're in a marriage with one person until you die, and you're expected to love that person until you die, may create a lot of stress on a marriage. So you actually create this distinction between the ideal marriage where things are supposed to happen, everything's supposed to be lovey-dovey, and the real marriage, which is about survival, and you have to pay the rent, and you have to pay the bills, and sometimes you go hungry, right? So that is not necessarily the ideal happily ever after image of marriage that we tend to feed children. And of course, one result of that is increases in divorce rate, and therefore second singlehood, people being single after being married, sometimes with children, and then blended families, which means as divorced parents get married, remarried, now they have children, so now you have a family made up of step-parents and stepchildren. And of course, child rearing, taking care of children has changed radically. We no longer have the expectation that children are an asset. We don't think of, okay, this child is going to go out and work, earn some money, and then support me in my old age, or maybe I'll marry them off in order to get a lot of property, right? This is the way people used to think about their children. Now we think about children, oh, we love them, we care for them. What do we get back? I don't know, but they've transformed from an asset to a liability. And this may be why people are having a lot less children, right? Because they can't afford them anymore. And then later in life, when the children do grow up, you've got what is called the empty nest syndrome. Older adults maybe they're married, maybe they're divorced, but they're living longer, so they're going to have a longer period after their children have left. And of course, sometimes that means they can help with childcare, help with childcare and other factors. But at some point, they're going to become older and need care of their own. So now we have a new phenomenon where you have what is called the sandwich generation. So parents who are taking care of their own children and at the same time taking care of their parents who are maybe now old and sick and so on and so forth. And we haven't even gotten into many other issues here. So the question is, what is the normal family now? Right? What is the normal process? What is better? Is it better to have a family based on love or a family based on convenience? Is it better to have parents staying in the home with their children, or children staying in the same home with their parents, or better for them to all spread out? So certainly there have been big changes in expectations within the family. So when we think about, for example, single parenthood, this was seen usually as a big stigma in the past, particularly for middle class or upper class families. If a daughter came home pregnant, that was a massive scandal that usually had to be hidden, either by forcing her to marry the father or somebody to cover up the illegitimate child, or taking them or forcing them to have an abortion, even if that were against the religious beliefs of the child or the family, or even to the stage where sometimes they pretended the child was the child of the parents and not of the daughter. So you had grandparents raising a child as if they were their own, and the daughter having to pretend she was the sister. Right? Divorce also has become much more normalized than it used to be. Again, in the past, it was much more of a disgrace. But as you've seen, for example, you look at these statistics, over this from 1959 to 2012, so over that period, the number of married couple families with children has remained remarkably stable. In other words, it's gone up a little bit, then down, then gone up, and then back down again. So you have 25 million families in America with children, even though the number of people in the United States has doubled during that period. On the other hand, single-parent families have gone straight up from about 3 million rather, to about 13 million families where you only have one parent. And again, this could be because of unwed mothers. It could be because of results of divorce. Another major change in expectation is we expect relationships within marriage to be more egalitarian between men and women. So the gender-free norms about doing housework and things like that. Now, in reality, if you look at the statistics of who does what, women still tend to do the vast majority of housework. Even when men think they're doing half the housework, they're really not doing half the housework. It's because they have a different perception of what doing the housework means, right? So when a guy washes the dishes and he takes out the trash, he's like, phew, I just did a lot of housework. Whereas women are like making the beds, dusting, vacuuming, mopping, sweeping. There's no real comparison. So it isn't exactly equal, and some people say that there's like a double shift for women. Women go to work, they come home, and then they have to clean the house, whereas guys will tend to go to work, come home, take their boots off, and turn on the TV. Another expectation is the idea of having two working parents or a single parent who's working, and therefore not necessarily one parent whose job is only to take care of the children in the house. And this is partly because of necessity. The economy has changed. Wages are lower, so maybe you need two parents working or both two incomes in order to keep the family running. Or by choice. It may be because more women are deciding I want to work, so I have the feeling of having my own money, having my own, not having to argue with my husband every time I need money, or simply having a social life outside the home as opposed to just taking care of kids. In the 1860s, when this begins, right, that the marriage rate was about 10 out of 1,000, which meant that any given year, 1% of the population got married. Well, 2, I guess, because you have a man and a woman. So 2% of the population would get married. And you see how constant that is. Of course, you have a jump during World War II, because when people came back from the war, well, they wanted to get married and get back to a normal life. And then there's a drop, probably because of this jump ahead of time. There's also a drop in the Great Depression, because when people don't have money and they're depressed, they don't want to get married. Then it went back up again. And then you notice here, after 1980, there's a steady decline, substantial decline of about 30%. So now only 7 marriages happen per 1,000 population. That's a substantial drop. And so you have to ask, why are less people getting married? At the same time, the divorce has gone up. So it used to be almost nobody getting divorced, but then there's a steady increase throughout the early 1900s. There's a spike during World War II because a lot of people were left alone, may have gotten divorced because of that. It then goes back down again, but then goes way back up, and then goes down, because partly it's following the trend of marriages. As less people get married, of course, less people can get divorced. But now we have a situation where before maybe 2% of marriages ended up in divorce. Now we have a situation where about almost half of marriages end up in divorce. And there's a lot of arguments for why. Some macro, there's more stress on the family, there's more, divorce is more easy to get legally, but there are also a lot of micro answers. Individualism's on the rise, so people are more likely to maybe say, I'm tired of this marriage, I want to do my own thing. Romantic love, so today marriage is based on the ideal that we love the person, and so if you fall out of love or you realize, I never really loved him, I loved his car, right? Then, maybe you get divorced. Women are less dependent upon men. They can work, they can earn an income, they can even go on welfare. So this then also gives them options, rather than staying in a marriage that they don't want to stay in or maybe abusive. There's a lot of stress in marriage. Some people argue stress has gone up because modern life is more complicated, more difficult. And again, divorce is now socially acceptable. So when you look around you and you see all the other kids' parents are divorced, maybe you're like, well, how come my parents aren't divorced yet? So who's taking care of the kids? Right? So as we can see, parent care has gone down. It's only 27%. And that's because, again, a lot of parents are working. So we see children are much more likely to be raised either in relative home or in a daycare center of some sort. A little bit more rare because of its expense is having a full-time babysitter or nanny. And then, of course, you might have a neighbor or some other provider who's not a relative take care of your child, which is typically what we consider an informal daycare center. So the question again would be, what is the implication of this? Is there going to be more child abuse as a result? Is there going to be less attachment between children and their parents? But again, if you go back in history, very few parents took care of their children. if you were rich or aristocratic or the king, you would hand your children over to a nanny and a wet nurse as soon as they were born, and you would only ever see them on very fixed occasions. The idea that children were loved and cherished, that is really a very, very modern notion. For poorer people, obviously they couldn't afford to just give their children away to a nanny. They would have to take care of them, but they were working. So the children often had to fend for themselves, and as soon as they could, they'd have to pick up a bucket and pail and start working themselves to help out with the family budget. Remarriage and blended families, as we talked about before, more people are remarrying. That creates a situation where you have step-parents, step-brothers and sisters. Some of the benefits to that may be that people can work out new relationships. They can be more flexible. Other concerns may be about child abuse or about children being confused about who their parents are, particularly if the parents are fighting with each other during divorce or after divorce, and children may grow up with a very negative self-image because, of course, here are the two people who they count on the most complaining about each other. So if divorce isn't a bad thing, sometimes the effect of divorce may be a bad thing, and that's something parents need to deal with. Family violence, of course, again, the reality is whether as a child or as a husband or wife, we're going to be with our families more than anybody else. And that's very likely where abuse and violence is going to affect us. We find that women are much more likely to be injured by a husband or another family member, even raped, than by a stranger. Because those are the people you live with. And sometimes we're ashamed to talk about what happened because this doesn't match the ideal in our mind of what a family is supposed to be like. Nowadays, all states have marital rape laws, but that wasn't true in the past. A lot of states didn't recognize rape within marriage because it was assumed that marriage gave the right to sex, so therefore you couldn't deny sex to your husband. Abuse against children is also quite prevalent and needs to be looked at. And again, it comes up to an issue of many conservatives feel that the state or teachers or social workers should not be prying into what's happening within the family. So when you look at uncovering abuse, whether it's against women or against children within the family, it means you're changing the relationship between the family and society. So again, it comes back to a social debate about what is the meaning of family in society. Another issue, of course, is new reproductive technologies. It sounds great. We can have test tube babies, so infantile couples can now have children. But it raises a couple issues. One is the issue of surrogate mothers, in other words, women who are paid to bear a baby for however long it is. 9 months, right? 9 months. I remember now, right? And that's a significant thing to ask somebody to do, right? Essentially, they are alienating their own body for somebody else's pleasure, right? So it boggles the mind when you think about Marxist concepts of alienation. We are literally selling or renting out, I guess you could say, the uterus in order to be exploited and used for somebody else's benefit. You could say that's a great thing. You're giving somebody else the gift of a child. But there are a lot of moral issues involved in that kind of stuff, particularly when the women who are doing it are going to be poorer, members of minorities. You have to say, is this a form of exploitation? The other issue is genetic manipulation. So we're getting to the point in science where we can say, hey, you want a blue-eyed baby? You want a blonde-haired baby? You want a white baby? You want a taller baby? You want a stronger baby? Now we can manipulate those genes So you could have the baby of your choice, and then that creates a lot of moral issues around those types of things, right? I mean, what if everybody chooses to have white, blonde-eyed babies? Okay, so I guess you eliminate the problem of racism, but now we only have one race. We don't have genetic diversity anymore, right? Genetic diversity is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And who knows what the result of those genetic transformations are going to be, whether or not those children, when you tweak their genes in one way, okay, it's like dogs. We can breed a stronger, taller, bigger dog, but that dog may have heart defects or may have brain issues or other types of issues because the manipulation of one thing may also influence many other things. So again, a lot of issues involved in that. Alternative family forms. Again, I talked about singlehood. We have more one-parent families. Obviously, if you're raising a child by yourself, there's going to be more struggle. Typically, these families are going to be poorer. They're going to have less opportunity to work their way up. But again, it depends. If it's a necessity, very often it's going to be a negative thing. But some people choose to have a child by themselves. They don't want to necessarily have the hassle of having a husband or a wife. Just give me a child. So again, there are issues. If they can handle it, they can put up with it, why not? On the other hand, it happens in many, many cases by necessity, and as society, we do nothing about it. We're not forcing people to get married, and whether that would be a good thing at all is another whole issue. Again, a lot of people are choosing not to get married, simply live with their boyfriend or girlfriend rather than getting married. Now, this, of course, used to be called common law marriage. Many people in the past didn't bother getting married. Most peasants, most poor people or workers didn't bother getting quote-unquote married because it was very expensive or difficult to do. So they just skipped it. They moved in together, and then became legalized as a common law marriage. Nowadays, people don't even do that. They just want to live together, and until they have children, there's no issue at all with this anymore. It used to be, again, a huge scandal, particularly for women to be living with a man. And again, in some societies, women are killed for that kind of stuff. So this still happens in today's world, that women are treated very differently in terms of sexual matters. But in the U.S. and the West, this is becoming much more common, as is people simply choosing to live alone, just live with a roommate or live by themselves. And of course, another alternative family form we have today is the gay marriage issue, whether homosexuals should have the right to marry and then adopt children and form basically their own family units. And this has already started because gay marriage became illegal in the United States and some other Western countries beginning in about 10 years ago. Research, by the way, shows that children raised by gay parents really don't have any major issues compared to children raised by straight parents. In fact, there may be less abuse because typically if gay parents are going to raise children, they've adopted them or they've gone through a lot of work to have them. So, although some of them also may be from blended families. So, one of the benefits is that child rearing is more of a choice, and therefore they're less likely to abuse children. However, the big issue, which is the same issue for divorce with relation to divorce and single mothers before, was the fear that the children of gay parents may be teased or harassed by other children. But again, this should not be a reason for not doing something. You shouldn't decide, I'm not going to do something because I might be teased or harassed. On the contrary, you should say, why are we allowing these people to tease or harass? Period. Right? But seriously, I mean, the reality is, as this becomes more socially acceptable, those things will cease to happen. On the other hand, there are some people who believe very sincerely that this is a moral issue, that it goes against their religious beliefs, and therefore they don't want or they don't believe that this should be allowed in their society. So this comes up with a lot of issues. Okay, there's moral outrage by some people, but should that matter? Should we determine our society based on whether or not it suits the moral perspective of some people in our society? As a sociologist, you would have to say, well, if it were everybody or the vast majority, like in the past, maybe you could justify it from a functionalist perspective to say that these behaviors upset people, therefore it upsets society. There still is an issue today from the point of conflict theory, because a lot of the people who are opposed to gay marriage are also opposed to women's rights and to things like the pro-life abortion issues, and they have formed a political bloc, and that political bloc does have a political impact because they have determined several of the last presidential elections and certainly help influence a lot of what happens in Congress. So it does have an impact. Again, whether or not you like it, it has an impact. And it's something to consider whether, what that impact is. In any case, so anyway, a lot of issues to consider. I know it's been a long lecture. I apologize for that, but there are many issues we need to talk about, and I hope you think about them more yourself as you go through your life, and you can always research more about any of them that you feel like. All right, have a good day.